Hello, friends. Welcome to my talk, Systems Design Interviews for People Who Hate Systems Design Interviews, or System Design, whatever you want to call it. Apparently, I've been saying it wrong all this time. Also, if you're visiting from elsewhere, a big welcome to my city, and I hope you enjoyed your time here. Slight warning, I found recently I'm annoyingly and unconsciously mixing up the terms system design and design system. If you hear me say design system, what I meant to say was system design, unless you ask me about design systems, but please don't. So, who am I? My name is Chris, and I lead a mobile development team at 1&1 Mail and Media Applications. We're known better by our brands, GMX, WebDE, and Mail.com. We're the leading email provider in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland with a total of 42 million active users worldwide. Outside of work, I talk a lot about neurodivergence and mental health. I occasionally do a bit of activism, and I've got a midlife crisis friendship with crows. A midlife crisis, if you will. So, why I talk about systems design interviews, and specifically for people who hate them. The industry is currently expecting a lot more from developers, and a lot of this is down to the market. There's also an element of them saying, well, you've got AI tools now, so you should be able to do more. I went to a panel discussion about a year ago of engineering managers where they were talking about the development market. There was this argument that developers should be more full stack these days. Now, I started my career as a full stack developer, but this was nearly 20 years ago, back when server code and front-end code were intertwined, when JavaScript was a thing you used to change colors or images when the mouse cursor interacted with something, versus the big, rich ecosystem of complex frameworks it is now. So as these areas of coding grew and became complex areas in their own right, we saw fewer software engineer job ads and more front-end engineer or back-end engineer, and of course, later, mobile engineer. And especially mobile engineer, actually, an extremely complex discipline with multiple facets. You have to deal with battery, sporadic network connection from multiple devices and operating systems, and all on a platform that will punish you if you are too hungry for resources. So it made a lot of sense that as these areas of coding grew in scale as to what you needed to master and what you needed to actually do, that we simply accept that people focus on these areas and become expert front-end engineers, expert back-end engineers, mobile engineers, instead of being a jack of all trades and a master of none. And that's actually my motivation, why I moved into Android development a decade ago from full-stack engineering. So to hear a panel of engineering managers suggest we should move back to this was a little baffling. In fact, later on in the conversation, when they were talking about the expectations on engineering managers, a number of them said that they shouldn't be expected to code because too much expectation in the role may lead to a lack of focus. It took all my might to resist asking, but shouldn't you be more full-stack engineering managers these days? The fact remains, though, that increasingly I've seen developers who started their careers solely in mobile suddenly facing a more full-stack systems design interview situation that was previously reserved for engineering managers, or at least a hybrid. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to write this talk. So, an anecdote. My first ever systems design interview. It was for an engineering manager role, and the brief at the beginning was very open-ended: build a dating app. Now, a few years before that, I worked for a dating app. Well, dating app is stretching it somewhat because it was extremely adult, and I don't think much dating was occurring, but that's the term. I knew the tech, I knew the challenges, I knew the product, I knew what most dating apps could do better. So, of course, my eyes lit up because I thought I could build this, you know. I was ethical. I told them, look, I've worked at a dating app before because I wanted to disclose this in case it gave me an unfair advantage. They didn't seem bothered, so I jumped into building this system. And how did I do in that interview? I did okay, but just okay, and with some blunt feedback. I got the job in the end, but the systems design interview was the weakest of all of them. How did I mess that up? I had the knowledge, the experience. I'd actually worked in that arena, and I loved working in that arena. What had happened is I didn't structure my system building for that interview. And of course, I started deep diving right from the beginning, doing a depth-first exploration into whatever areas of a system came to mind first, rather than starting from a high overview. Then later deep diving into certain areas. Part of this is a personal thing, it's an ADHD thing, and I do see a substantial number of neurodivergent people struggling with system design interviews, not least because when our brains are firing ideas, we often need to write them down immediately, otherwise they'll be forgotten for the rest of time. And of course, that encourages us to explore things in that sort of depth-first way, to deep dive too quickly. So this was when I learned my first and probably most important lesson about systems design interviews. You're not judged on whether you're good at designing systems, you are judged on whether you can show you're good at it in the space of 45 minutes to an hour. You could be the best person at systems design in the world, but if you can't distill that appropriately into a 45-minute segment, something that we never have to do in the real world because we have the luxury of more time and we're normally not doing it on our own as well, you might not have given them enough signals in that 45-minute period to tell them that you're the best person in the world at systems design. So some caveats before we go a bit further. Firstly, there is a load of wonderful material online for people who live and breathe systems design interviews and can do them flawlessly in their sleep, right? I am not one of those people. I don't think I will ever find these interviews a breeze, but I hope that conversely means that I've got a solid understanding of the struggles a number of you also have. Secondly, systems design is laced with opinions, deliberately so. And in this talk, you're going to hear a good number of mine. It doesn't mean those opinions are correct, and it certainly doesn't mean the advice applies to everyone and everything. So always, please feel free to be critical of my approaches. Do the things that work for you, scrap the things that don't, modify them if necessary, and if there's something missing here, if it really helped you, missing from here, that's really helped you, please, I'd love to hear about it. And, honest moment here, this was one of the hardest talks I've ever had to write. I spent 2 months poring over notes, and at one point the other day, I realized that in writing my talk that lectures you about the importance of not cramming everything into 45 minutes, I was cramming everything into 45 minutes. This talk was hard to write for the same reason systems design interviews are hard. The scope is unending. I cannot give you everything. I cannot cater for every experience level on this subject, so I've tried my best to find the sweet spot. I'll try and point you in the direction of the areas that have come up a lot, but it'll be for you to take that away and look at them in depth. I did wonder if this slide is a little bit redundant, given you probably wouldn't have turned up to the talk if you didn't already know, but there will certainly be some of you who haven't done your first interview yet, so let's briefly look at the typical structure of the interview itself. Now, this is a profound oversimplification, but generally speaking, the interviewers give you a system or a problem to solve. For example, we want you to build a news feed, or maybe something a bit more abstract, like we want you to build a push notification system. In some engineering interviews, sometimes you'll get a set of screens, but largely you'll start with some form of problem that you need to solve. First, ask all the questions that you need to know to build it. After that, with a mixture of diagrams and notes, you produce a high-level visualization of the components you think solve this. Maybe dive into the data objects for your features, so SQL data schemas or just simple JSON, especially if it's an engineering interview rather than management. And at some point, either because you're done or because time is running out, you'll move to the discussion phase. They'll poke holes in your design, they'll ask you how you'd improve it, or maybe give you a specific case or curveball that might require you to make a change or two. And hopefully you aced it and you got the job. But I already knew this, right, when I went for that first systems design interview. Interviewer gives me problem, I solve problem with magic diagram, give me job, please. What I wish I'd seen is this wonderful quote. The system design interview simulates real-life problem solving where two co-workers collaborate on an ambiguous problem and come up with a solution that meets their goals. The problem is open-ended and there is no perfect answer. The final design is less important compared to the work you put in the design process. This allows you to demonstrate your design skill, defend your design choices, and respond to feedback in a constructive manner. A number of you who have done systems design interviews will know the book this is from. And if you don't, I really recommend you get it. It's often considered the Bible of systems design interviews. And I can recommend it not just for your own prep, but because the real-life examples of interview problems and the suggested solutions are actually quite fun and fascinating to read. As you leaf through each one, you start also noticing patterns in problems and, more importantly, patterns in the answers as well. And you learn certain approaches to certain problems. But I like this quote in particular because it doesn't tell you what systems design interviews are. It tells you in a few words what you should do and what is expected of you. And if we focus on the key bits, there is no perfect answer. You are not expected to come up with a perfect answer. In much the same way, you're not expected to if you're doing it at work, because there isn't one. That's obvious when you think about it. What you're expected to do is to solve a problem the best you can and justify your solution. And remember all those maths exams where you didn't get the marks if you only put the answer and didn't show the working out? Interviewers want more than just the answer. More than even just for the reasons. They want to see how you come to it. They want to see you discuss more than just the option you chose in the end. Discuss the trade-offs between them and why you end up on that final option. And I just want to focus on the very last part of that sentence, actually. Because there's no one right answer, inevitably there's a discussion. There'll be suggestions and feedback, exactly as if you'd be doing systems design in real life. And how you react to this feedback will be crucial. And I personally word it like this. It gives a glimpse for interviewers, often other developers, as to whether or not they can work with you. So how you behave is paramount. Are you humble? Can you notice when you're wrong? Once again, this seems obvious. Whether or not they can work with you is a criteria in every interview, right? But because these problems are so open-ended, far more so than your typical coding challenge, and because there's a variety of solutions, no one single right one, you will be involved in an exchange of loose opinions. And this is a perfect arena for interviewers to see how you play with others. If they challenge one of your approaches, do you act defensively or do you respond inquisitively? Are you grateful for the rigor that they are giving your ideas, or do you show a visible irritation? When you don't agree and you think the interviewer is wrong, do you respond respectfully, Were you humble? When you didn't know something, were you honest about it before giving it a go? In effect, are you telling them that you're going to be a good colleague? Or in other words, maybe the system design was the friends we made along the way or something. And this works both ways, by the way. This isn't just the company interviewing you. You're interviewing them as well. Do they hold themselves to these standards? Are they telling you that they'd be good colleagues? For so many reasons, not least because personally, it shifts my mental state from a defensive, oh, I'm in an interview and I must be flawless mode. I really recommend constantly reminding yourself to conduct this interview as if you were doing that exercise with your current colleagues. So here are some examples of problems you might be asked to solve, but I really stress, don't rely on this. Don't simply learn examples and textbook solutions. You may end up with a problem in an arena that you know absolutely nothing about, whether that's a product area or a technical area. My recommendation in those situations is just to be open and honest about it and try your best, because it isn't about whether you can find that one right answer. And the worst that can happen is that the interviewers see how you react in that unfamiliar area and how you sought to get around that. And also, remember that when I had an area that came up that was intensely familiar to me, a dating app, I didn't do well overall. So knowledge in the area doesn't necessarily give you what you need to do to succeed. So common problems. If it's an interview specifically for a mobile position and being conducted by mobile developers, there's a good chance it revolves around solving common mobile difficulties. Maybe about correctness of data at all the places it needs to be, at all the times it needs to be there. So user does something on device A, will it be reflected when they look at device B? If they do something on device B while it's offline, hasn't yet been synced, how does the system deal with conflicts when it finally is? Or maybe they'll focus on the UI. How do you deal with large amounts of the same data, so lists? How do you page those lists? How does your paging respond if the order of that data changes as the user is scrolling through? How do you deal with syncing race conditions if the user performs a change in that list right before a server sync returns, which then updates the UI, briefly removing that change before bringing it back after the next sync? Often the type of interview you'll find yourself with depends on the role you're applying for. If it's an engineering manager role, you're likely to be expected to know more of a greater ecosystem, even if you're a mobile developer and it's a mobile engineering manager position. Whereas mobile developers themselves largely won't be required to explain the intricacies of database sharding. Well, yet, anyway. So I'm going to go over a few of the things you should do, then I'll cover a few of the things you should try and know. And I know that this is a lot, right? So I put this one slide as a TLDR. Take a photo of it, okay? I don't expect you to read through all of it now if you use it. When I was first looking up for information about system design interviews, I did it because my first system design interview was a few days away. I didn't have time to read a book or deep dive into services I'd never encountered before. So if this is you right now, that's the cheat sheet I wish I had back then. I will put the slides up online later, but you might want to take a photo, as I said. And if you've got an interview, go revise. Just cover a few points. Firstly, chapter 1 of the systems design interview book. That's a really great overview of the basics of the knowledge you need for a full stack systems design interview. Chapter 3 covers in depth more the approaches you want to take, but chapter 1 is the most important. I still use my notes from chapter 1 every time I start interviewing, again, as a refresher. We'll go into this in more depth in a second, but one of the hardest things to do when you're in a systems design interview is disciplining yourself with time boxes. You don't want to deep dive too much too early, that you don't actually complete a basic high-level overview of a system. And the later stages, especially the discussion, are vital for interviewers to get the signals they need to know if they can take a bet on you and hire you. So if you don't get to those stages, because you spent too long on the previous stages, that can kill your chances. Third point from the end, super important. If you're at any interview where after you've raised, oh, I made a mistake, and then you go back and correct it, and then the interviewer says, aha, you're not so good at this after all, I recommend not working there, okay? The problem is them, not you. It's so rare for that to happen. And one of the qualities a lot of interviewers will be looking for is the ability to self-reflect. People make mistakes. You know, the test is how you recover from them and how you learn from them. You're not being evaluated as superhuman. And conversely, if you don't correct yourself, or worse, if you remain stubborn on a point where you deep down know that you're really wrong, that will indicate to the interviewer that you would sooner cover things up rather than face the humility of admitting you made a mistake. Before the interview then, what can you do to prepare mentally? There is no harm in asking the company about the expectations of the interview. I know people have a lot of concerns about this. You're not asking for the answers, you're just asking for the expectations. The first 3 questions here, normally you tend to get them these days and in the email that's inviting you to it, because believe it or not, a lot of companies have realized that candidates failed not because they were bad at systems design, but because expectations of how the assessment was going to go were not aligned. The last question I ask, actually, not so I can take a look at the person on LinkedIn and find out about them, although I do, but because their role might give you an idea as to what's going to come up. If they don't have a mobile background, you're probably not going to be talking about the deep intricacies of the Android stack. And it's likely it'll be a higher level system you'll be focusing on. And please, 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 if you have any specific needs, any disabilities, I really recommend informing the interviewers in advance if you feel comfortable. I know this is easier said than done. I know also not everybody has the privilege of choice. Making sure the interviewer is aware of this before the interview means they're prepared for it as well. And interviewers, if you're out there, I really recommend putting that, inviting that in your email that you send out to people. It really makes such a huge difference. I'd recommend doing some diagram drawing if you haven't done any before, but don't obsess over it. Nobody is marking you on whether you use the correct shapes or not. The practice is just so you don't suddenly go quiet when you're painfully trying to drag shapes and labels across the screen. And finally, I find it doesn't hurt to check out the company's tech blog, but do not make the mistake I made of making assumptions as to what might come up in the interview from it. I checked a blog from one interview, saw the interviewer was really interested with event-driven architecture and had implemented something really, really cool using Redis. And I stupidly stayed up all night reading systems design interviews, examples on event-driven design, and even did a deep dive into Redis and the problems it could solve. I turned up to the interview, super exhausted with barely any sleep, and the brief was create a web app for a company's internal book library. It was really tough to try and wedge Redis into that diagram. But what it did mean, though, and I don't recommend the full deep dive, is going to that blog meant that at the point of the interview where it comes to your questions, you can talk about the things that you learned from the company's tech blog. It shows that you made the extra effort to take an interest in what they do, but don't stay up all night learning Redis. So now you're in the interview. And here we have that time box suggestion I have on the cheat sheet. This is generally how the interview will proceed. But I do stress the timings are a guideline, and you may spend a bit more or a bit less on some stages. So I'll go through each step in turn. The introduction is simple. Obviously, hello, who are you? Give a brief rundown of your career, but do keep an eye on the time when you're doing that, because I've seen people talk for 5 or 10 minutes. It eats into the rest of the interview. Then they give you the problem, and you ask questions to gather requirements. So key here. Your job in this part of the interview is to reduce the scope of a problem area as much as possible. So I was asked to build a dating app. Could I do that in 45 minutes? No, of course not. So you ask for questions that turn that massive task into something you can cover in that 45 minutes. It also helps you to understand the areas the interview probably wants you to focus on. And some of these questions, the answers to these questions might already be obvious from the brief. So, number of active users, it tells you what scale you're building for. But if they've told you to build Facebook, that's different than if they've told you to build the internal library app for their company. You don't need the same setup. Growth expectations tells you what you need to future-proof against. Ask them, what do they expect growth to be in the next X months, for example. It tells you what your design needs to scale to. Whether you support offline or not makes a huge difference to the scope of your system. I mean, unless the answer is yes. But quite a lot of the time, that will be out of scope. And that also gives you an idea as to where it is they want you to concentrate on. Where are your users? Do you need servers in that region to reduce latency? Supporting multiple clients obviously gives you an idea as to how quickly they might expect the user's data to propagate across the system. If it's a mobile-heavy systems design interview, knowing whether you have to support low-end devices may have an impact on your design choices. And this one's quite a big one. It shouldn't really be at the end. I'm sorry about that. The expectations in response times, that can dictate whether you're building a complex event-driven system or if you're just using long polling. I'd also recommend asking questions about the product, or at least that shows that you're thinking about the product. So if you're building, for example, an online book reading app, ask the user, maybe the user should be able to highlight and take notes. And I know that goes against my recommendation of reducing scope, sort of adding it in, but the likelihood, honestly, is that that's going to be out of scope of the interview already anyway, but it'll be appreciated that you demonstrated how much you're thinking about the user experience. And as you get all these answers, note down the acceptance criteria for this system, because you'll need to refer back to it. Then you've got to knock together the high-level overview of a system, normally in a diagram or a set of notes, as again, resist deep diving into each component too much. And for each component, when you explain why you think it's a good idea, also think about the other options, at least mention one other option and why this one is more appropriate in this circumstance. What you ideally want by the end is a basic diagram or notes where someone can see the direction of where you want to go and could take what you've produced and largely then know exactly what direction you want to go when they deep dive into the deeper implementation details. Always, when you're doing this, constantly refer back to that acceptance criteria you've been taking notes on. It's so easy to just miss something that was quite key and asked of you right at the beginning, and that can be a killer. Some things obviously can only be dealt with in the deep dive, but just make sure everything that needs to be in the high-level overview is there before you move on. And don't forget, have a constant dialogue with your interviewers. After this stage is complete, I personally tend to ask more if it looks okay to them to get buy-in, if there's anything they feel missing, and then I ask them if there's any particular areas I think they should focus on in more detail. And then we go to the deep dive. This is tricky to provide a manual for because it's always based on the problem given to you and how high level it is to begin with, or the answers to the questions you've asked and the buy-in you've got. But generally speaking, the most pertinent components or components the interviewer has indicated you should focus on, go into them in a bit more detail. So I don't know, maybe here you'll be building classes or schemas, etc. And if it's not clear what they want, ask. It's a matter of personal taste, but I'm always cautious to also ask if I'm diving too deep, just to ensure we're still aligned on the thing they want me to focus on. Don't rely entirely on assumptions, and don't assume that because the interviewers are being quiet, they're quite happy with what you're focusing on. And although they'll discuss things as you go along, there will be that reflection stage at the end where they'll ask questions. And one of the questions I hate most in systems design interviews is, are you happy with this design? Like, no, I'm not. It's something I knock together in 30 minutes. How would you improve it? Because A, it doesn't tell me anything about the areas of a design they might have an issue with, and B, it's a system I threw together in half an hour. They will ask that question. So if you find yourself stumped with that question, as I still often do, I try my best to imagine myself implementing this now. What would be the most critical components that still have lingering unanswered questions? What limitations are there that might be a problem later? What did you simplify as you were sort of trying to fit everything into 30 minutes? Or that question, if I had more time, I'd do this. Those are the things that you should probably start asking. And also talk about the things that you're happy about. Don't just criticize it. Say, I'm quite happy with this, but just don't just do that. And here's a summary of the general tips. To be honest, mostly for the purpose of the offline slides. Reduce scope, ask what depth they want to see, take notes as you go along, and obviously keep talking. Don't go silent. They need to hear your reasoning. Portion out your time. Show them that you'll be a pleasant colleague to work with. And after, you probably want to close your laptop and go for a nap or whatever. I heavily recommend doing one thing before that. Note down all the parts where you were stumped, where you slipped up, or where your knowledge wasn't as up to scratch as it could be, because you will not remember them in half an hour, I promise you. And add this to what will become your study plan for next time. And finally, I always send an email to the company thanking them for their time, asking them to pass on thanks to interviewers, and asking them if they would be so kind to provide feedback, whatever the decision ends up being. A lot of companies don't, but feedback from interviewers is the most valuable you can get because they're the only ones that saw what you did. Okay? It also helps you decide, frankly, if you get rejected, whether it was you or them. And just some general advice, right? Practice system design interviews by doing system design interviews. If your first ever system design interview is the company you really badly want to work with most, well, that's going to be your first practice interview. Am I saying you should apply for jobs that you're not sure you want? Yes, actually. Because you'll be surprised at how many times a company might convince you in the interview process that actually they are the place you might want to work for. I'm not saying you need to cross your personal absolute red lines and apply for companies you really, really would never want to work for, companies that do bad things like weapons or tobacco or React Native. But keeping an open mind ticks both boxes. The worst you get is practice. The best you get is that they convince you. And lastly, don't build a perfect system, build the just enough system. When I was asked to build that app for that online library, you might think, well, that's really, really simple, so that'd be an easy interview. There's an inherent assumption that you become the Olympic champion of systems design interviews when you can build the most complex app. What a lot of companies actually want to know is, can this person make the right trade-offs? Can I trust them to understand the business cost versus benefit of what they're proposing? So just enough, with some redundancy if necessary. So we've covered things you need to do. I've already mentioned it's impossible to cover all the things you need to know. There are plenty of resources out there, but specifically for mobile developers or those applying to be EMs, I thought I'd include a few basic suggestions, just 2 slides, and I'll try and skip through them quickly. I know this is very dry stuff. System design interviews are not fun. They can be. But one important tip, just avoid the anxiety of needing to become an expert before the interview. Read up on it, but you are, in my view, much better in shoring up and revising your knowledge in your core area because that's where people expect you to be good. Yep, there'll be some things missing here, I'm sure, but I can't put everything on a slide. This is actually the list I have in front of me when I'm doing a system design interview. I don't have the answers to those questions because that depends on the problem, but I found myself often forgetting the mobile stack. There'll be something that I just forgot. So I just have this in front of me just to remind me. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I did want to make a special mention actually to patterns because this definitely comes up in most interviews I've been in. Even if your answer just by preference is always one of them, like MVVM, be ready to explain what that means in a few sentences, okay? And especially in comparison to maybe another like MVP. Okay. Bare minimum list of recommendations for back-end elements for mobile developers. One thing I notice comes up quite often from people that talk to me is being asked to write the REST endpoints. So literally just the name of the endpoint, so book, for example, the verb, for example, get, and the parameters, ISBN, whatever, and then the example JSON schema that's returned. If there's some auth element, maybe headers as well. With databases, helps to know the basics of when you'd use SQL versus NoSQL. And I really mean just the main points that I won't go into too much here, but the obvious questions like, does the schema change a lot for the same object? Maybe you want to then avoid MongoDB, or it doesn't and you have lots of similar data objects with relations to each other, maybe SQL. I'll leave you to explore that, but you don't need to dig too deep. Otherwise, again, chapter 1 of the systems design interview book and read up a little on the things that are in there that you're unfamiliar with. You don't need to be an expert in those concepts, just understand what they do and the benefits and drawbacks. And here are my overall favorite resources, whether that's for the interviews or for systems design overall. There are actually 2 of the systems design books. The first one I'd recommend definitely, and the second has a lot more cool interviewing examples. I also really like Andre on YouTube, especially his study mind map. It's quite big. I don't think you necessarily need all of it, but if you really want to deep dive in this and become that Olympic expert, I'd take a look. And the last one isn't exactly a systems design book per se, but it is really good at outlining the overall challenges on mobile, both technical and business. And that will inform your thoughts as you're designing your systems. But I need to know everything. You don't. And in fact, I think the reason a lot of people are so intimidated by systems design interviews is that we all watch for wonderfully skilled people in these example Google interviews online and think, damn, I could never be one of them. Or to put it another way, it's hard to motivate yourselves to do the slow incremental steps to reaching a full 10K run if you're constantly comparing yourself to an Olympic gold medalist. I honestly, personally, do not think I would pass a Google systems design interview. Yet I have passed most of the systems design interviews that I have taken in my career. Most of the time, you're not applying to be a lead architect at Google. So worry about being an Olympian if you apply to be in the Olympics. So do your best, learn from your mistakes for next time, and keep at it. You'll get there. Thank you very much.